James Vedda has worked at the Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategy since 2004. Previously, he taught in the Department of Space Studies at the University of North Dakota. He has a PhD in political science and a master's degree in science and technology policy. He is also a mentor of one of my former interns, so I think that's pretty awesome. And he's retiring soon to go off and play music, so I think that's also pretty awesome. So James, really great to have you here. I'm really looking forward to your presentation. I'm gonna jump into my files and pull up your PDF, and I'll post that to the chat in just a moment. Okay.
Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me, Michael. And as I mentioned before, I'm sitting in for Angie Buckley, who was originally scheduled to do this slot. I am her stunt double, so I will make remarks that may not necessarily be the same thing that Angie would have said or anyone else at Aerospace Corporation would have said. So these are my comments alone. And I'd like to key off a little bit of what Michael just said a few minutes ago, in that we have to look at all aspects of our space development, even though we like to talk about and look at pictures of our hardware that's developed along the way, and in fact even specific types of hardware that get most of the attention. So I've always been a big proponent of developing a space infrastructure concept, particularly in cislunar space, because I remember back to a comment made by one of my favorite old space pioneers, Kraft Ericke, almost 40 years ago. He said that if God had intended for men to be a spacefaring species, he would have given us a moon. And in fact, we do have a moon, but I think I would reinterpret that in a way where you would say, if God had really, really, really intended us to be a spacefaring species, he would have given us a fully functional cislunar space infrastructure. But we don't have that. We have to build that ourselves. And as Michael mentioned a few minutes ago, we tend to dwell on the glamorous parts of it, the spacecraft and the rockets. They're very visually compelling. They are the things that we associate with space development. But I'd like to push for attention to the less glamorous things, because they're all quite important, but they tend to slip our attention. Even in infrastructure on the Earth, if we are talking about what it takes to make up a city, and most people in that city don't even think about infrastructure, and those who do probably associate it with stuff like the electric grid and roads. But how many people think of stuff like sewage? I mean, it's just certain parts get neglected. So we have to incorporate all of these infrastructure elements in our thinking right off the bat, and that means the on-orbit servicing and even things like space weather prediction. That has to happen in near real time as operations increase there. The generation and distribution of power, the extension of our ability to do space-based navigation in a way that encompasses all of cislunar space. All of this is a training ground for what's going to come later on as we move beyond the Earth-Moon system. We've got to learn it here, just like when you were a kid and you had to learn how to behave and maneuver in your own little neighborhood before you could venture out more widely. The same kind of thing is true today, because today we are infant spacefarers and we still need to grow up. We haven't even hit our adolescence yet. So all of that has to be learned in this this area that we've called cislunar space or the Earth-Moon system. before we venture beyond. So how are we going to do this now? In funding, that's the next aspect that Michael was talking about earlier. You might look at the fact that okay, NASA is taking this seriously now, and their funding has been increased recently. In fact, in the FY22 President's budget proposal, NASA is going to get a raise, and it is set at about 24.7 billion. Sounds like some serious money flowing there, and that's a good thing. Now, if you look at the segment of that that's devoted to the Artemis program, that's about 6.9 billion. So in other words, about 28% of NASA's budget devoted to Artemis. So what happens if we are seriously trying to set up a cislunar infrastructure that includes all the components that we need, and not just for a one-off use, but actually for ongoing use, for multi-purpose use, for use by all of the participants in that development process? Well, if you compare it to the development and maintenance of infrastructure on Earth, you find out it's very expensive. So what money do we have available to us from civil space activities? If you add up all of the civil space budgets from countries around the world that have such budgets, you are in a ballpark of something like $50 to $60 billion a year. So NASA is the biggest piece of that. So let's be generous and call it at $60 billion a year. And if you just assume that 30% of each of those budgets is going to be devoted to developing that cislunar infrastructure, that gives you around $18 billion a year. Sounds like a lot of money, but really it's not enough. It's not enough to establish, develop and establish the new hardware, and then to continue to operate it continuously as a sustainable system. So there has to be more participation in the system by other sectors that include primarily industry, and not just industry traditionally associated with space program activities. So the industry obviously needs some type of incentive to be involved in a way that's going to allow them to make money. If we look at projects, very large projects that industry has done, and often has done collaboratively across multiple companies, you see that there's been some pretty big things. The Transalaska Pipeline, for example, which was built in the mid 1970s for a cost of about $8 billion. And a little bit later than that, in the early 90s, the English Channel Tunnel. That was also a completely privately funded activity. And that took 6 years to build, and at a cost of $13.5 billion. And both of those projects, if you adjust for inflation up through today, each of those projects would be in the neighborhood of $30 billion. So these were successfully executed by private companies working as teams. So can we see something like that being done in space? Well, yeah, if the proper incentives are in place, because there's companies that have a lot available to invest. If you look at the top companies in the Fortune 500, it's an interesting list when you trace over a number of years those top 10 companies. So if you go back a decade or so, the top 10 was dominated by oil companies. If you look at the latest list of Fortune 500 top 10, there's only one oil company in the top 10, and it's Exxon at number 10. Exxon used to be always on top. Now that's shifting around, and it's large retail companies and information technology companies that are dominating that top 10. And in fact, you see companies like number one now is Walmart with a last year having a profit of $13.5 billion. That's not revenue, that's the profit. Okay. Amazon is number two. Their profit last year was 21.3 billion. Apple is number three, and they were at 57.4 billion. Now they had a greater profit. They rank these by revenue, but I'm giving it figures for how much profit they had. Okay, so Apple's profit, in other words, for 1 year, was more than enough to pay for 2 years of NASA's entire budget. Okay, and if you also look at, we all know that Apple has a big bank account. It's estimated that they have cash in the bank equivalent to around $200 billion. Now, if you've got a piggy bank of $200 billion, you may think, wow, they can do almost anything they want without borrowing any money. But the truth of the matter is that they were, in this past year or so, borrowing at record rates for the company. And this seems to be counterintuitive. Because if they've got $200 billion in the bank, why do they need to go out and borrow money and at a rate greater than in the company's past history? Well, the reason is that interest rates were low and they're planning ahead. They wanted to get those interest rates locked in so that they could have that capital available to them. And that's an interesting way of operating that you really can't do with government agencies. Because of the laws and the procedures that they have to follow, they can't plan that way. They can't have a piggy bank of billions of, or tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars. They can't go out and borrow money that they don't actually need right now just because interest rates are low. But private sector can do that. So they have avenues of generating the capital needed for these huge projects that are not available to the government agencies that we usually think about for space development. So that's one of the reasons why the private sector needs to be brought into this activity, and not just as a contractor, but as entities with skin in the game. So, so that means that the incentives to convince them to join into something that will eventually be profitable need to be front and center to get them on board. They have expertise, they have lots of well-trained people, and they have the money. So that's how we're going to succeed in the long run. And before I run out of time, I wanted to talk about one aspect of how we think about the metrics for success in doing this. You've heard over the past few years that Jeff Bezos is fond of saying we've got to work towards having 1 million people living and working in space. Okay. Now he's not the first to say that, but he's been a prominent voice saying that over recent years. And hey, I really like Jeff Bezos. I shop all the time at his online store, and in fact, I've even shopped at his brick and mortar supermarket that he has now. So great. That's fine. But I think his metric is wrong, because we should be doing as much as we possibly can with automation, because that is going to ultimately drive us faster and be more affordable, because we all know how much extra cost is added to space projects when you have people that are involved that have to be sustained in these very hostile environments. So yes, people will be involved, but if you can have one person managing 100 robots doing the work on the lunar surface, for example, I think that's better than having 100 people doing that work. If we want to advance this, we don't want to have, as it's been called, a self-licking ice cream cone in which the whole purpose of the hardware, the facilities that we install out in space, is to sustain people, and then you've got nothing left to do other value generation. Our metric should be how much value are we generating by our activities there, whether we're talking about scientific value, economic, or other types of value. That's your metric. And the most that you can do with, the more you can do with automation, the better. So that is, I guess, the message takeaway here is that the maximum involvement of private sector, including non-aerospace companies, is going to be essential to this development. Allow them to use the types of value generating and funding activities that they are accustomed to and that they are very good at, and then measure it with the right metrics. So I guess why don't I stop at that point and see if Michael, you want to have any further discussion or bring up some questions.
Dr. Vedda, thank you for that. I don't want to kind of beat a horse to death here, but it does come down to budgets. Can you kind of put on your wave your magic wand, pull out your crystal ball, and kind of imagine, what do you think some budgets are going to look like going forward? Historically, lately, we've been at half of 1% of the federal U.S. budget. Do you think anything's going to change there? Is that kind of consistent, do you think?
Well, that percentage of the budget thing, I don't see that changing at all in the near future. Instead, I think that we are going to find some shifts in what's going to be expected of NASA, and that can be characterized by their plans for after the International Space Station. NASA has already said, we're not going to build another one of these. We are going to rely on the private sector to provide us, at least in LEO, provide us with on-orbit habitation and laboratory facilities. And those operational things are going to be shifting more to the private sector because the capabilities have been increasing. Right. I mean, look, when NASA was started up, we were all at square one. We had no one who could go out there and say, yes, we know how to do space and we know how to do it economically. We know how to do the science. We know how to do the commercial things. No, it was all working up from scratch, and who had the resources to do that type of thing? Well, governments had the resources and could marshal them to show results. But that was not intended to be the way it would be done forever. So, I mean, sometimes there were people in the business at NASA who kind of forgot that their job was to make space so easy that it could be handed off to others. So some things that we developed were handed off to operational entities. NASA and the Defense Department worked on communication satellites, and that got handed off to the private sector. They worked on weather satellites, and that got handed off to NOAA. So we are going to see, I believe, more situations in which things that are developed in NASA, supported by NASA, are going to graduate to a new life in other operational entities, and that NASA is going to be more of the innovator, the enabler, and not the operator, because they're going to get out of operating space stations. They're still for a while going to be into operating rockets with the SLS once that starts flying, but the indicators already are saying that this is probably going to be the last time that we're going to look to NASA to create new rockets and operate them.
That is a big shift, right? I mean, that's gonna cause some blood in the streets and at the congressional level.
Yeah, so we have we have that situation kind of hanging on where SLS is this government project and probably always will be, but the sophistication of what's going on in the private sector is going to make the next generation, including very large boosters, something that makes more sense being done outside of NASA.
Well, that's exactly the segue I was hoping for. Michael Mealing and I have been referring to kind of the Starship singularity, that everything changes once you have that super mammoth launch capabilities. So am I implying correctly that you think that the era of NASA building another super mammoth launch capability like the SLS, those days are over? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think they're going to continue on with the SLS program of record, but sure, yep. Beyond that,
but there's no SLS 2.0.
Right. I don't think that they're going to go beyond that because look, we're already seeing at least a couple of companies in the U.S. that want to pick up the baton from them and take over for a large capacity launch. And this is a good thing. I mean, if NASA would reflect over its entire history, it should be celebrating that because, look, we made this happen.
Right. They're enabling.
We be proud of ourselves for doing this.
Yeah.
So we've made space easy enough for others to take over. So that's what I think is going to be happening in this next generation. So that's going to have implications for NASA's budget. It's going to have implications for how the Congress sets up its oversight of the U.S. government space enterprise. So I suspect that there is going to be some substantial changes that we are probably going to be seeing within 10 years. I've talked to a lot of people about this who suspect things are going to stay pretty much as they are until 2040. I'm not so sure. Okay. There could be changes that remain very subtle for a long period of time, but there could be dramatic changes as well, driven by lots of different things, whether it's dollars or whether it's international competition, or whether it's the development of something in cislunar space that makes it worth investing substantially, like say some of the microgravity sciences that we'll be doing come up with something that affects industries, affects the medical profession in significant ways that encourage more activity to be done in space. Because we've only scratched the surface in that. I mean, there are people who were back in the 80s saying, "Oh, this whole microgravity thing, it did not live up to its promise." And wait a minute, we've hardly begun to investigate that. We have not spent the hours, days, years of research that you would do in a terrestrial lab for any other scientific activity. We haven't put in the time in space research yet. And when we do, we may find that something, whether it has to do with with manufacturing, or whether it has to do with the pharmaceuticals industry, or whatever it might be. We could hit on something that makes it worthwhile to invest in space as costs come down and the value generation goes up.
So if we're watching a situation where budgets will remain largely flat, I'm going to just round it to $25 billion, but that the two largest expenses, the International Space Station and SLS, will eventually shrink. Do you have a guess where that? I'm going to guess that those freed up dollars are probably going to go to the moon. Do you think that's a safe guess?
Well, if NASA is going to continue to stand up and take responsibility for sustained activity on the moon, then I would say yes.
Okay.
That's something to be determined by future future administrations and Congress. If they are going to continue to have the major responsibility for making that happen. So yes, I think that's where it would go. But when you have an annual budget process, and some turnover in the Congress, it's really impossible to predict how they're going to treat legacy programs, and it's just as likely that they could see that all of this freed up money goes somewhere outside of NASA to be used for other programs that could be terrestrial infrastructure, like we're talking about now in the Congress, and or it could be to beef up the social programs that are going to be necessary for our aging population. There's so many factors across society that could prevent the excess dollars, the peace dividend, whatever you want to call it, from staying within NASA.
Okay. I've got a question from Michael Mealing from the audience. Quote, for the commercial sector, especially the finance side, to be involved in a meaningful way, it needs to see some commercial markets beyond just government contracting. Given that the biz case for space resources for use on the Earth won't close until marginal costs are roughly equal, have you given any thought to what those markets might be? So kind of future lunar markets.
Yeah, I don't see the lunar resources being used on the Earth as anything that's coming along. Probably not in my lifetime. But the use of those lunar resources to teach us how we can live off the land in space. I mean, that's probably, if you want to come up with a catchphrase for something that is the most important thing that we do in the next generation of cislunar development, is learn how to live off the land in space. Because if everything, I think your audience knows this well, if everything is always dependent on supply lines from Earth, right down to the air and water we need to survive, then things are going to be not developing much beyond an Antarctic research station. If you really want things to develop fully, those resources are going to have to be processed in space and used to make structural parts for other construction, or even things like circuit boards that will be used for the electronics that are used in space. And as we construct new things like more innovative space platforms, solar power satellites, things like that in space, that's where the lunar resources side is going to contribute. But I think we should not yet write off that materials processing research, because it could show us some ways to manufacture things that can be done better in space, and that would have sufficient value when transported to the Earth to make it worthwhile. So we're still you're pretty low on that learning curve for those things. So let's set up, when we set up those facilities that NASA is counting on the private sector to do for research purposes. Let's fund some of those projects to make the results that will generate value and encourage more participation, even from non-traditional businesses.
Terrific. Dr. Vedda, really appreciate you being here. Thanks for filling in for Angie. She's irreplaceable, but you're an amazing replacement, so thank you.